Jim Cullen running his race for Portsmouth Sheriff against Michael Moore.
Yeah.
And so, Jim, we appreciate you for coming in here today.
Thank you, Eugene. I appreciate you guys inviting me.
So I got to ask you, I was looking through your background.
Yes.
And it is rather incredible. I mean, the amount of experiences that you have, it seems like you've done so many different things between military experience. We'll talk about Coast Guard experience. But one of the questions I have for you, you actually had a very unique experience, too, on 9/11 with your career. Just if you could tell the people about that.
So try to make a long story as short as possible. I was both a New Jersey police watch commander and simultaneously a reservist in the Coast Guard. And a bunch of things that happened. I was a Coast Guard police officer. That was my enlisted job. Some things happened that got me some attention, and I was able to get an age waiver to apply for OCS. A funny story we can talk about sometime offline involved wrestling a clown to the ground in New York City. It was kind of humorous, but it also is really super high profile. I arrested a clown, and so this resulted in me getting an age waiver. First being named the Enlisted Person of the Year for the Coast Guard, which was quite an honor, and then I get there's a picture, and then I wound up with a waiver to attend OCS. So I attended OCS. I thought I was going to be going to an assignment in Boston. And what wound up happening instead was I worked my overnight shift as a police watch commander in New Jersey from the night of September 10th into the morning of September 11th. Went home, went to bed, and then I had a dream that the phone was ringing. And then I woke up and the phone was ringing. My wife had already left 13 messages on the answering machine. And she said, turn on the TV. I turned on the TV, and 15 minutes later, I've got my New Jersey police gun belt over my Coast Guard uniform, and I'm roaring toward New York City, calling every other reserve member that I knew, because we could not reach our command in New York. That was one of the first things that got knocked out. And so we were screaming toward New York City, all of us, all different cops, who were reservists, roaring toward New York City. And we met in a particular location. It's called Aids to Navigation Team New York. And again, this is my first day as a commissioned officer. So I step out of my personal car, and there was a senior chief there, and he said, "Sir, what are your orders?" And this was not covered in my OCS program, but luckily I was already a working police officer, and we went to work. We started bringing and escorting every vessel that would float across the water to Manhattan and pulling people off the seawall and bringing them back to New Jersey. And we'd set up a field hospital and a triage location, and we'd set up a morgue using refrigerated trucks that we commandeered from a nearby container facility. So that was my first day of active duty. That was my first day as a commissioned officer. And if you're ever bored, there's a movie, about a 15-minute movie called Boat Lift, and it'll tell you something about what happened that day in New York City.
I just wrote it down so I can go back and watch it at some point. I mean, talk about a first day experience. And so how long were you with the Coast Guard? And I mean, your career, you've had
27 years.
Coast Guard.
Yeah, 27 years. I was promoted because the Coast Guard was not really that involved in law enforcement operations ashore at the time. This is 2001. We'd gotten heavily into regulatory and environmental protection and things like that. So that they suddenly needed people who knew how to be law enforcement officers again. So I was suddenly, congratulations, you're now the chief of police for Coast Guard law enforcement operations in New York and New Jersey. And we were doing things that hadn't been done in years, like escorting liquefied natural gas tankers, through these narrow channels to make sure that they weren't attacked, or escorting VIPs and dignitaries. I was personally escorting the Secretary of Transportation, because we were under Department of Transportation at the time, into the site and into New York City and stuff like that. So, yeah, it was crazy. And then that leapfrogged on to a whole bunch of other really high-profile things, like the blackout of Manhattan, which happened shortly thereafter. Most people don't remember that, but the evacuation of Manhattan that happened again. The Flight 587 crash, which was an aircraft that we initially thought was another terror incident that happened not long after 9/11. The Staten Island ferry crash, the Miracle on the Hudson crash, if you remember that, with Captain Sully. The start line of multiple New York City marathons, which have security for 40,000 people, which all happened right there at our location on Staten Island and on the Verrazano Bridge. UN General Assembly security, multiple Democratic National Conventions and Republican National Conventions, all these crazy history-making, events.
You were around for.
Yeah, but I wasn't planning this, right? So I describe my career as a lot like Forrest Gump, like all these, these incidents that occurred that I just kind of stumbled into the middle of them and found myself involved in.
And you're from New Jersey?
Originally Northern New Jersey, yes.
And then you moved here in 2009?
2009, I came down here because the Coast Guard had their pre-deployment training here for something called RAID, which was a Redeployment Assistance and Inspection Detachment. So we were cross-trained this is deploying to Iraq and then Afghanistan. So we were trained as Customs Border Clearance agents, and also, believe it or not, APHIS, Animal, Plant, and Health Inspection Service agents. And our job was to go to Iraq, Afghanistan, and several other countries of the Middle East and essentially do law enforcement, hazmat workups, and anti-smuggling, anti-contraband work to make sure that stuff wasn't coming back to the United States or being smuggled, which unfortunately happened far too often. So the pre-deployment training just so happened to be right here in Portsmouth. And that was my first exposure to Portsmouth. And the first time I walked up and down High Street in Portsmouth, and I said, man, this reminds me of where I started out my career as a foot patrol officer. It felt exactly the same issues and problems that my team, back in 1985, my team of 4 people that were brought on under this Safe Neighborhoods program as foot patrol and bike patrol officers, felt like the exact same situation. And with the same problems and the same potential solutions. That was when I first got a germ of an idea in my head that we could probably turn around the downtown if we just bring out some foot patrols and some bike patrols.
Well, I think that's a really good segue here into, with you having all of these different experiences, as you describe it, like a Forrest Gump type
Yes.
storyline, and what a book you could write if you have not done so already. How do you believe all of those experiences, and if you want to speak to specific ones that translate directly, how do you think those serve you well in your pursuit to be the sheriff of Portsmouth?
So it happens, I see it happening on multiple levels. Again, the city has a lot of the exact same problems that I've seen, and I was actually hired and trained to address in the past, which is trying to attack problems at the grassroots level, trying to be the neighborhood-friendly law enforcement officer that everybody knows and who knows everybody, and who's responsible for starting initially just a few square blocks, because that's how I started out with my career. You knew a few square blocks, and you knew everybody in it, and you knew everything that was right and everything that was wrong. And then you served as the hub and spoke to bring in resources as were necessary to try to address the biggest problems that were causing the biggest impact in the community, whether it was non-governmental organizations, faith-based organizations, city resources, whatever it may be, but you bring the resources to bear on the problem that's having the most negative impact on the community. So technology and time has unfortunately drawn law enforcement officers away from that face-to-face contact far too much. Air conditioning in patrol cars and tinted windows are probably our biggest barrier to the community. So I really want to get back to that, and that was actually a volunteer program that I'd started when I started volunteering with the Sheriff's Office 10 years ago, which was having people out on foot and on bicycles in our neighborhoods, in Old Town, in Craddock, in Dale Homes, Southside Gardens, London Oaks, out there engaged with the community and being someone who they got to know on a first name basis so that they break down the barriers and people are willing to have the conversations that they're never going to call 311 for, they're never going to call 911 for, they're not going to speak up in a neighborhood, a civic league meeting necessarily, but they'll talk to you privately and tell you, did you know that, this mom is having some problems, her kid's hitting a certain age, or did you know that these people have food insecurity, or, whatever the situation may be. And let's then figure out, as a law enforcement officer with the ability to contact all these different people and say, can we bring those resources to bear on that issue and on that problem? But another way I see all of these different experiences, especially all the federal experience and the emergency management experience to bear on this, is because no one is treating our gun violence and our drug problem as an emergency right now. And I'm not saying this to insult anyone. It's just that concept has not yet arrived here in Portsmouth. If you look at it statistically, and I always throw out the example of the DC sniper. If you remember the DC sniper, that was a huge and impactful thing that so many people were caught up in. And if you remember the sense of urgency, and you remember the response that we had to that, and you remember all the mobilization of resources to deal with that, 27 people shot in a 10-month period. But then you look statistically at Portsmouth, and you look at Norfolk, and you look at some of these other cities, and you look at the statistics, and you realize we have more human beings being shot in less of a time period than in the DC or Beltway sniper, however you remember the name of it. So where is the mobilization of resources? Where is the sense of urgency? Where is the sense of emergency that accompanied something like that? That's what's missing. And also, you've got siloed efforts in all these different municipalities. Norfolk is doing their thing, Portsmouth is doing their thing, Chesapeake is doing their thing, and so on. But they're not working together in a unified command structure, and they're not operating under something called the incident command system, which is something that fire departments use, something the Coast Guard uses, something that I was trained in, because we didn't have the staffing to do all of the things that we had to do over the years. We called in other resources. We coordinated them to go after the problems using a unified command, saying maybe the best thing we need right now is, who knows, anything from a homeless shelter to a animal control officer to a food pantry. Who knows what we need? But the point is having all of those being able to be drawn in to a unified command structure, but most importantly, recognize it as the emergency that it is and treat it as the emergency that it is. And then the other part is, again, all these multiple hats that I've had dipping back and forth between city law enforcement and federal law enforcement and emergency management. I think that people who have spent their whole lives in the city of Portsmouth are numb to the fact or just blinded to the fact that we have a major target here in our city, two of them actually, which is the shipyard and the Naval Hospital. These are targets not only for, obviously, kinetic strikes from outside, but also, terrorism activities, espionage activities, things like that. And right now, that's just not on the radar of the local law enforcement. And if you think about the future attacks that are going to come against these facilities, and the same thing's true in Norfolk with the shipyard, it's going to be a problem that's going to come from outside of the gate. It's going to come from somewhere outside, somewhere in the community. And law enforcement needs to be looking for that right now. They need to be aware of it. They need to be in close communication with the federal officials and need to be thinking about this and knowing what sort of pre-attack indicators to look for before the problem happens. The time to start the handshakes and to start the conversations is not after the bad thing happens. I've seen that firsthand, and luckily, when I had that 9/11 response, luckily I had been responsible the year before for the security for OpSail 2000. So we already had the relationships. OpSail 2000 was this giant maritime event where they bring all these ships into New York City. So I'd been responsible for the security for that, so I already had the relationships, I already had the numbers in the phone, I already had that concept in my head. But if I had gone into that blind, I would have known, who do I reach out to get a launch ramp for our boats? Who do I reach out to get, those reefer trucks that I had to use, that kind of stuff. You need to have those conversations. You need to start working your emergency action plans, exercising them in advance of an issue or a problem. And I just don't see that happening right now in the city. And I can, in my mind, imagine the after-action analysis of somebody saying, boy, these things should have happened. But let's do it before the problem happens.
Let me backtrack just a little bit, because you were talking about gun violence and you used the word urgency, and you felt that there's not enough urgency in your estimation right now. So what does urgency look like?
Urgency looks like unlocking funds, declaring an emergency and unlocking funds and putting more patrols out on the street as a deterrent, and simultaneously working on it from the other end, which is trying to address it from the grade school and middle school and high school level on up. Right now, the sheriff's office has the DARE program and the school resource deputies, but they are not communicating fully with the police department about issues that start in the schools and that will inevitably boil over into the communities where, unfortunately, these kids actually have the guns. In the schools, they're behind metal detectors, and so they're not bringing guns into schools, hopefully. But if there's a beef that begins in the school, it's predictable that this is going to spill over back into wherever these folks live. And unfortunately, these days it isn't, like back in the day where you'd go out and fight it out, with your fists in the street. Now it comes down to having a converted Glock with a switch and an extended magazine, and you just go past that person's apartment building and spray it. And we've had incidents in the city where problems began in the school, but they were not, whether it was a training issue, whether it was an experience issue, I don't know, but the information was not being passed to the police department from the school. And this is where I feel like the school resource deputies can be doing far more, whether it's a training issue, again, like I said, but they could be doing far more to recognize these problems before they spill out into the community, and working in partnership with the police department to say, hey, just so you know, this happened today, and because if they're doing their jobs correctly, they know every single kid in their school. They know when those kids are acting right, when they're not acting right, when they're when they're having emotional issues, when they're having an argument, and hopefully they've established the relationships with other kids that leads them to be able to say that the kids will be comfortable coming up to them and saying, hey, there's a problem here. If you've got that kind of trust relationship, then hopefully you can, again, bring in the necessary interventions to say, let's stop this before it occurs. Let's intervene in this sequence of events before it turns into something fatal. Because unfortunately, we had a situation where a child was killed who just happened to be looking out the window, and it had nothing. This 10-year-old had nothing whatsoever to do with the beef, but there it is. Because they're using indiscriminate fire. So that is a sense of urgency. That is a sense of saying the lives of these human beings who are being killed, or who are the shooters, because we have to empathize with the kids themselves who are finding themselves in these situations. They're the product of an environment, unfortunately, and we have to address it. So it's a sense of urgency of trying to stop it before it occurs, but even going further back in the timeline and trying to address all the issues and problems that lead to these kids finding themselves in a situation where they feel like the only solution is to pick up a gun and to go out and engage in this kind of behavior, whether they've seen it modeled by someone else, whether they've been exposed to it since childhood and they've become, just numb to it. We have kids that are growing up with PTSD. No one's identifying it necessarily as that, but when you're exposed to the level of gunfire and violence and deaths and funerals that these kids are exposed to, and you see that glazed look on their face, they're immune to this kind of stuff, but they're not immune to it, and it's not being recognized, it's not being treated. So the sense of urgency is trying to address this in multiple different ways before the incident occurs.
Yeah, it was one of the things that's been the most disheartening for me is in having conversations with a lot of community activists who work in these spaces. And I remember one of them just straight up telling me how easy it is for young people, children, to get their hands on a weapon these days, and how a lot of them will either carry them in a backpack or they carry them on them sometimes just for protection because they think it's cool. And so to hear that, some of it echoes with what I've been hearing and talking with people who are working in the community right there in Portsmouth. Part of this, though, if you're talking about deputies in schools and doing the efforts of patrolling, you need people, you need staff, and we know it's been documented. Hiring has been a challenge, not just Portsmouth, but across the board when it comes to law enforcement. What are your plans to try to push to get more hires in the department?
So another, like we were talking about, a lot of people are just, it's like if you grow up near some sort of beautiful waterfall or near some sort of beautiful mountain or some sort of beautiful view, if you grow up with it, you don't recognize it for being the resource and for being the amazing feature that it is. So that's when I talk about how people don't recognize the resource that we have here in the city, which is the fact that we are a military city with these major military installations in it. And that brings with it military members that are in the process of preparing to retire. Because a lot of folks that find their way here in this area, right down the street is one of the Coast Guard's major commands. The shipyard is a major command. The Naval Hospital is a major command. So when people are getting up to be around 20 years of service, that means they probably have kids that are of a certain age that are settled into middle school and high school, and they've already got the hook is in the mouth at that point to say, I don't want to pull my kids out of school. I don't want to disrupt their lives when they're going into high school. So they're already settled into the area, maybe starting to think about putting down some roots, starting to think about what comes next. What's going to happen for me career-wise? And if this is somebody who started their career, especially on the enlisted side, at 18 years old, that means that they are going to be 38 and eligible to retire. So how do we get those folks to think about working in just a different uniform, switching uniforms and saying, I'm going to come over and do this thing for the sheriff's office? So many years ago, I started a program here in Portsmouth, which brought currently serving military members through a nighttime training program. They attended the law enforcement academy at night. And we had to jump through a lot of legal hoops to get this set up with the Coast Guard specifically. We had to go through the legal command and get a legal opinion saying that it was okay for us to do this as long as we draw a bright line between the Coast Guard's law enforcement powers and the sheriff's law enforcement powers. But we'd go through this nighttime training program, and then they would volunteer as deputies here in the city. So one of the pictures you've been rotating through shows me in a yellow shirt in a sheriff's uniform. But that was exactly what we were doing. I went through a nighttime training academy, and then I was out doing foot patrol and bike patrol. And then I reached out to other Coast Guard members who said, that's kind of cool. And they wound up coming out and doing the same thing. And we started getting involved in the community. We started engaging with folks, right across the water from where we're sitting right now, from the base of High Street all the way down, and then into Craddock, into Dale Homes, into all the other neighborhoods that I named earlier. And we learned the value, or proved really the value, of having that interpersonal connection. So we, the volunteers, were getting the phone calls that weren't going to the police department. We were getting the messaging that wasn't going to the police department. So the point is, now you've got folks who've had a chance to test drive the career and to test drive the agency. And it's an easy step now for them to say, you know what, I'm already certified, I'm already trained, I already know what to expect when I go over there. I think I'm just going to come over and work for the sheriff's office. And because I have my military pension, because pay is always the challenge in the area. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be paying people everything that they're worth, but if we are financially strapped and only able to offer essentially the same as the rest of the agencies here in the area, then you've got someone who's got their pension plus now they've got this job. They're actually making pretty good money at that point, and another set of investment options for them down the road, separate from their thrift savings plan. So we have that resource here in this city, and nobody else has that outside the Hampton Roads area. Nobody else has that constantly replenishing pool of new people coming in from all over the country to come spend time serving in Hampton Roads and in Portsmouth specifically, and then potentially stay here as a public servant in whatever capacity, whether it's sheriff first and foremost. I'd love to see them, I'd love to hire them, but police, fire, emergency management, public works, code enforcement, all the things. These are people who are accustomed to working in a structured environment, who are accustomed to working in government. They're right here, and we're not doing enough to keep them here. And we have far too many people who are retiring from the military within a stone's throw of all of our local government offices, and they're taking jobs in Seattle or they're taking jobs in Florida or whatever it may be. So we have that resource, and that's how we address our hiring crisis right here in Portsmouth.
With a little bit of creativity,
yeah.
I hear from that as well. A big portion of what the duties for the sheriff, the jail,
yes.
Making sure everything with the building, within the building, is doing well. Portsmouth obviously had a very big change within the last year, moving its services to the now former Hampton Roads Regional Jail.
Correct.
Just want to ask what your thoughts are about moving into that facility, and just from your estimation and what you know about it, do you have any ideas or plans for it if you were to step into this role? Because that was a very big step for the city of Portsmouth. And I guess I'll just go ahead and ask as well, what would you push for the now old building, what you think should happen with it?
Right. So, I'll start with the old building. The old building, the plan is to knock that down and maybe have an implosion party before the end of the year. Mayor Glover has already discussed having, literally blowing it up and having, people come out for an implosion party. And then it's up to the city government to decide where they want to go next with that. I assume that they're going to be looking for bids from people and proposals from people, from developers to come in and say, what is our vision for the next 50, 60, 70 years of that waterfront? It is really, they got one shot at making this right, and it's going to be pivotal to the downtown. I'm involved in a lot of these discussions and conversations because of other boards and commissions that I'm on, and also instrumental to that is going to be people having a sense of safety and security in whatever project comes up there. And I hope to play a role in that by having those foot patrol guys and bike patrol, deputies out there that I talked about. But that's the old jail, and that's going to be leveled. So the new jail, again, represents opportunity, because the city inherited a jail that was designed for a lot more capacity than the city actually needs. It has, I believe, 1,300 beds, 1,300 beds, and our average population in there is 200 or less, which means a lot of empty real estate that can be repurposed for other things. So one of the first things that pops into my mind is, let us create a joint public safety training academy for sheriffs, obviously, but also police, the fire department's code enforcement and fire marshals, city code enforcement officials, anyone who does law enforcement here in the city, to get them training together under the same roof so that they are starting to think in that unified manner that I was discussing earlier. Right now, what we're doing is we're sending people up to the regional training academy, meaning the police department is sending people to the regional training academy up on the peninsula, which is hours spent on the road, unfortunately. And, it's the danger and risk associated with a lot of time spent on the road. But it's also having people have constant exposure to other law enforcement agencies, and other law enforcement agencies are training them and looking at their scores and saying, hey, this person's a pretty good student. I want to grab that person. So we're losing a lot of people to the fact that we're not training our folks locally, and we're spending money outside of the city. The other huge opportunity here is to try to address the recidivism problem. So if you just simply warehouse people, and we hold 1 year, 1 year is the jail. Other than that, they'll go to a state facility. So if you warehouse a person for a year, and at the end of the year, you release them and say, okay, go be good now. Statistically speaking, that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is they're going to be around the same people, places, and things. They're going to have the same problems. They're going to be right back in the same kind of trouble. So how do we interrupt that? How do we break that cycle? So my idea is we bring in various trades, specifically skilled trades programs. The Tidewater Community College Skilled Trades Academy, which is right here in Portsmouth, has a variety of different mobile labs and mobile classrooms that they're willing to bring behind the bars and teach people pipe fitting and welding and electrical work.
They would go into the jail.
Yes, in a mobile trailer. So you've got a big campus, and I know you were flipping through some photos there, but they got a big campus that you can drive all the way around the outside and still be within the fence line. And so my idea is you enroll somebody into this training program while they're still in custody, and they get to hold in their hand their student ID. You are now a college student. You're now a Skilled Trades Academy student. Now you've got a goal, and you have a target date. So you start them with the classroom part, because there's big classroom space there in the jail. You start them with the hands-on as much as you can within the limits of safety, and you don't want people creating weapons and all that kind of stuff. But then here comes the hard part. When someone is released, it's that 24 hours. It's that critical 24 hours. And all of a sudden they're not focused on their training anymore. They're not focused on this program that we've gotten them into. They're focused on, where am I going to sleep? Where am I going to eat? What are my relations with my family? All that kind of stuff, trying to readjust to coming back to society. So this is where I'll put the military hat back on again. One of the things the military learned a long time ago is you can't take somebody from a structured environment where all those things have been provided for them and where they've been in a stressful situation and just throw them back to society. If I take a kid from Afghanistan or any combat zone and say, okay, you're going to get on a plane in the combat zone, you're going to land here, and now you're just free to do whatever you want to do. Well, they're going to get on a motorcycle and do 120 miles an hour and crash. They're going to drink everything alcoholic. They're going to go out and get into fights. They're going to do all kinds of stuff because all of a sudden you've lifted all the restrictions and the structured environment away from them. So my idea is the same thing, the same lesson that the Army learned or that the military learned, the same thing that my dad went through in World War II. They took him and a bunch of other returning World War II vets, and they sent them up to a military base in upstate New York, and they lived in a barracks. They ate in a chow hall. They marched to their assignment, but their assignment was to go through the first year of college. And they brought in college professors from outside and had them on the military base training these guys on how to go to college for the first time for many of them. Families hadn't done this kind of thing. And then over the course of the year, they drew back the restrictions and slowly, got them into civilian clothing, got them acclimated to civilian life. And then they were ready to go on to college, and they had a very, very high success rate. So same thing, the yellow ribbon program today, you will not, when I came home from theater after multiple times going overseas, I did not just simply fly home. I went to some other country and we would be on a base, and we essentially transitioned and started moving into civilian clothing and started moving into that transition back to the civilian world. So my idea is to offer the same thing to people who are currently entrusted to our care, to say, okay, your sentence is up, and to deliberately time this so that they start while they're in custody, but after interviewing and screening, they definitely want to do this. Okay, your sentence is up, but you don't have to go completely away. You have the option of going down the hall, so to speak, with a separate entrance, or however we decide to partition this off. But now we turn a section of that into transitional housing for people who are in the process of completing this skilled trades program, or the YWCA's women's empowerment program, or any other program that is moving people in the right direction of developing self-sufficiency and breaking the cycle. So, the uniform would be polo shirts and slacks or something like that in various colors, which gives them a professional wardrobe. They would have a place to sleep. They wouldn't have a roommate. The doors would be locked open, but the restrictions are you have to be in by a certain time. You get your 3 meals a day, lights out at a certain time. There'll be a lot of the familiar rhythms, but you don't have to worry about the top of Maslow's hierarchy. Where am I going to sleep? Where am I going to eat? All that kind of stuff. You're going to have that provided for you as long as you're focusing on continuing toward this program. And then the next part is people say, well, why should the citizens have to pay for something like that?
I was going to ask you, what do you think the response will be from the public?
So I've already had conversations. Remember, we're in an area that is a maritime defense and maritime production center. And ships aren't built the way they used to be built. It used to be the whole ship was built from the ground up, starting with the keel in one spot on a shipyard. And those are all controlled by, access restrictions. Transportation workers' identification cards are needed to get onto the shipyard or get on these other facilities. But a lot of that stuff is now being built off-site as subsystems and then brought in at the correct time to be installed. So a lot of ships are being built essentially in modular systems. So those industries are crying out right now for skilled trades workers, pipe fitters, welders, electrical riggers, folks who can work with their hands in the skilled trades are in high demand right now. So I have a verbal commitment, because I'm not in a position yet to do any of this, but I have a verbal commitment from 2 of the major regional defense manufacturers to pay for the program that I'm describing, because they see it as a wise investment in future labor force, and they see it as a wise investment in the city of Portsmouth. Because remember, these are the very same defense workers that we're going to be calling for if that, God forbid, emergency takes place. We're going to want them to be able to come and get to work trying to fix things or build things or do whatever we need to do in response to some future emergency. If not just the folks that I'm talking about, but the rest of the workers there, if we have this crime problem here in the city of Portsmouth that we do have, people don't want to live here. They don't want to send their kids to school here. They want to send them miles away. They want to live miles away in another city. So when the emergency happens and people are trying to respond back to these major facilities, they're going to be on the other side of some bridge or some tunnel that's going to be closed, the first thing that happens during an emergency. So you have an emergency here at the shipyard, but your defense workers can't get back here because of our crime problem here. And it's hard to get people to connect those dots, but it's a real issue that has been growing for years and years and years. Only a small percentage of the people that work at the shipyard actually live in the city compared to the number that live a significant commute away, some as far away as North Carolina. And we can fix this if we address the problems locally with crime, but also if we help build a workforce that's not going to go right back into recidivism.
Very interesting. You've really thought this out, by the way. I mean,
Yeah.
That was extremely thorough. And I was just going to say, I mean, there are so many studies that show that when individuals who have been incarcerated, who have been in jail, and they go out and they don't have a job,
Right.
their circumstances are not in a position that would lend them to being able to really survive well, then the odds of them going back or reoffending are obviously higher.
And then we act surprised, that this is happening. So this is not coddling.
Yeah.
This is recognizing that if we keep doing things the way we've been doing them, we already know what the result
You're
is
gonna
going to
get the
be.
same
We're
results.
living with that result right now. So let's try something different so that we can see if we can break this cycle, or do more at least to try to break the cycle for a certain number of people.
Well, let me ask you this question now. In terms of doing something different, the Trump administration has been very clear that it is changing the way that we look at our immigration policies. They're really being strong in their enforcement. They've had ICE officials and their offices working with departments across the country, obviously. And if you were to become the sheriff of Portsmouth, what would be your position in working with ICE agents when it comes to immigration?
Right. So, and I'm glad you asked this, because a lot of people want a yes or no to this. They want you to say, yes, I would cooperate with ICE. No, I would not cooperate with ICE. But it is much more complex than that, because when you say ICE, you're actually describing multiple branches. So ICE ERO is who you're describing. It's Enforcement Removal Operations. That is one entity. Separate from that is ICE HSI, Homeland Security Investigations. The people that you see on TV with the masks who are conducting raids and doing that kind of thing, that is ERO. The people that are out there doing, like, for example, just this past weekend, and I don't want to say too much, but ICE HSI was working here in the Hampton Roads area going after these massage parlors and places that are holding people in involuntary servitude here in our city, or places that are funneling money to foreign terrorist organizations, or people who are involved in bringing fentanyl into the country, stuff like that. So it's two different entities. So you can't say, I will not cooperate with ICE, because then you're saying that you're not going to cooperate with investigations into fentanyl and investigations into human trafficking and that kind of stuff. The other reason that people are very impassioned about this is because they see video footage of these folks, the folks with the masks on doing their raids and stuff like that, and then they will see other folks that have sheriff written on the back or that have police written on the back. And there once was a program, one of the different 287G programs, that allowed local law enforcement to be sworn as essentially, at the time, they were called, customs agents, but to be sworn as ICE agents and to go out and actually take part in the types of, raids or roundups or mass arrests that you're describing. That has not been legal since the Obama administration. Since 2012, there have been no local law enforcement participating in ICE raids. What you're seeing on TV is when the disputes occur, when the activists or the crowds or the protesters show up, then there's going to be a dispute. There's going to be, law enforcement, federal law enforcement, scuffling with protesters, and that's where the local police come in, and you see them pushing people back and doing that kind of stuff. They are not, and if they are, they're breaking the law, but to the best of my knowledge, they are not actually doing arrests. The local police have not been able to do that sort of thing since 2012. So the easy answer is to say, you will never see, with me as the sheriff, you'll never see my personnel going out and engaging in ICE raids. But also, they're not allowed to. And a lot of people are missing that, because there was a time when that absolutely was possible. It was mostly people along our agencies along our southern border that were empowering people to empowering their law enforcement officers to do it. There is another program that allows you to process people who are in custody in the jail. In other words, you're now a local sheriff, and you conduct your checks of anybody who comes in the door, and they pop up as a possible hit, to whichever federal agency, ICE, let's say. Then you could, if you send your people to this separate training, you can then process them as if you suddenly magically turned into an ICE agent and begin processing them for removal from the United States right here in the jail, and no ICE agent ever has to come out. So that's our local taxpayers paying for something that that ICE itself or that the federal government is supposed to do. And when I say that, I mean, to be able to do that, you have to send somebody down to Charleston, South Carolina for a month of training to be able to do that 287G jail enforcement officer program. It only happens inside of a jail. And then you have to send with no reimbursement. You're not reimbursed for that. So I'd have to spend the salary of someone to go down to Charleston, South Carolina for a month, and then come back so that they can essentially do ICE's job for them in processing somebody for removal. And then I have to send them back for refresher training every year or every 2 years. So there's been exactly one instance in the past year that the sheriff's office has had to contact ICE for anything because somebody came up as a possible hit. So it's not been an issue here, and it's certainly not cost effective to do that, especially with no reimbursement. That's the processing within the jail. Completely outside of that is, like I said, I cannot envision a scenario where you're going to have, and you will not under my command, have them out engaged in raids because it has been illegal since 2012 in this country.
So just to kind of recap, when it comes to the raids, this ERO,
yes,
under the umbrella of ICE, you don't see it likely, one, and then the legality of it in question, two. So that would be a no there.
It simply can't be done.
And then with the HSI, with more of the homeland investigations you were talking about, things in which, whether it's fentanyl or illegal activity that they're looking into from, say, a company or those kind of things.
Yeah.
Then yes,
because that's protecting. Yes, that's protecting our city, and it's important to make this clear. The sheriff doesn't decide who the population is, who the sheriff serves. The sheriff serves the city. We don't control who the city is. We don't say we want to include or exclude any particular group. We protect the people. You take your population as you find it, and you protect them all. The things that we're describing that ICE HSI are doing is protecting our city. If you're taking fentanyl off the street and you're cutting down our overdoses, if you drive around Portsmouth, unfortunately, you'll notice there's a whole bunch of these massage places that have popped up a lot recently because there's crackdowns happening in other cities. If you're going into the back where they have young ladies living who thought that they were coming to the United States because they were going to be a clerk at a hotel, or they were going to be a nanny, and they're being forced into prostitution, and they're living in some back room and they're being fed on crackers and sugar water or something like that, they're being held in bondage. It is good for us to intervene in those situations and to stop that sort of thing and to try to help those people. So it's not a yes, I would, no, I would not. I will help in any way, and I will cooperate in any way with any agency that's here to help our citizens.
Okay. And then when it comes to the jail situation, I'm just making sure I'm clear too in understanding you. You're saying that it's only been one time, to your knowledge, in the past year that there's been a situation where someone was pinged and said, hey, we might need to contact ICE for this particular situation. And in that case, if you were to be chosen as the sheriff, you would still contact, because it's not cost effective, from what I'm hearing, to train somebody, send them down, and for them to then transport them.
Correct. If there's a valid warrant for somebody, it doesn't matter where it comes from. If there's a valid warrant for someone, it doesn't matter what their citizenship is. It doesn't matter which agency it is that's contacting you. If we get a warrant out of Texas or out of Minnesota, it says this person is wanted for homicide in Minnesota, and that's part of your in-processing of a person. At that point, what you do is you contact that agency. Are you willing to extradite? We're holding them on our charges here in Virginia. whatever it is that brought them in. And then a judge locally has made the decision of how long they're going to be held or what's going to happen next. Are they going into, is there a bail, all that type of stuff. But you reach out to the other agency and say, this person is being held right now. We believe that they are a hit on your warrants. And then they go through their own process of verifying, and then they make their own cost-benefit analysis decision. Are they going to come out and transport? Because it's on them. We might cooperate, with, I don't know, with like, Suffolk or Isle of Wight or something like that. We'll meet you halfway, that kind of stuff. Probably not. We'll probably drive them right there or they'll come right here. But the point is, for extraditions like that, we want them to confirm that this is the person that they actually want. One of the issues that comes up a lot is ICE detainers. And I dealt with this as a law enforcement officer because as a watch commander on a police department, I had my own cell block. We would hold, people in custody. And it was a bigger problem back then because we didn't have the automated fingerprint systems that'll tell you right away this is or is not the person. But if a person doesn't have fingerprints in the system, but they come up with various identifiers, and if your name is Joe Smith, well, you're probably going to get a whole bunch of hits on Joe Smith if it's a common name like that. So if they've got a warrant for an individual and we have some degree of certainty that that is in fact the individual, okay, fine. Then we're going to hold on to that person on that warrant. But if they're asking as a courtesy to hold on to somebody after a judge here has said they no longer need to be held on local charges, now we're getting into a constitutional issue. If we're holding a human being in custody and it turns out that he's not the Joe Smith, and it takes 48 hours or 72 hours for someone to come out and say, nope, you're not the guy. Well, how do we compensate that person for holding them in a cell for 72 hours? When it comes to detainers, I have issues. When it comes to warrants, a warrant is a warrant, and that's good.
Well, I know we have just a few more minutes here. Thank you so much for your time as well as you've come in. I want to ask you this. You're going against an incumbent in Michael Moore. He's been in that role for some years now, and people kind of know how he's handled his business. What would you say distinguishes you from him that makes you a better candidate for this job?
I would say I'm trying to draw back and look at this job from more the 10,000 foot level, and I'm trying to see how this job has the ability to have a greater impact on the city, writ large. I have a lot of respect for the incumbent. I have worked with him for several years. But in our recent discussions and in recent community forums, he has said that he's going to only do what is statutorily required, the minimums, not to take it further and to say, I'm going to exercise my discretionary powers to do other things. I can respect his aversion to risk and his desire to not, be involved in, civil actions or whatever it is that motivates him to do that. But I feel like this is an emergency, and I feel like we need an all-hands-on-deck approach to deal with this. If we want to know what the sheriff's office is going to do for the next 4 years under Sheriff Moore, well, we can look at what's happened in the past 8 years and the amount of contribution or non-contribution to local law enforcement. Under me, you're going to have marked patrols on the street starting January 2nd, if I'm sworn in on January 1st. The police department is short by 90 police officers. We have hundreds of deputies. I intend to put them back on the street with full cooperation with the police chief and the police department as part of a unified effort to try to serve as a presence and a deterrent to try to cut down on some of this crime. Sometimes just being in the right place is enough to stop the problem from happening then and there, and offer time for other, for people to cool off, or for issues to, relax and chill a little bit before something turns to violence. So I'm going to start putting patrols back on the street right away, and I'm going to try to attack the recidivism problem. And then, last but not least, I'm so passionate about this because I've been a volunteer in the city for the last 14 years. I've been a volunteer with the sheriff's office for the past 10 years. I've been a volunteer my entire life. I'm going to do the job for no salary. I am not going to accept the pay for this position. I'm going to continue to volunteer. I'm going to take the money from that salary and put that right back into all the very same programs that I'm talking about, so that the taxpayers don't have to fund any of my crazy ideas, but also to go after some of these nonprofits out there and use my experience as a person who was the Coast Guard's chief evaluation officer and evidence officer to say, are you a nonprofit who can prove to me using evidence-based decision-making that what you're doing is actually intervening and breaking the cycle of gun violence and drugs and problems that we're having. If you can show me evidence that you are actually doing something that's effective, you can have my pay.
Now listen, sheriff is full-time job as well. And so I'm sure there's a lot of people who will be hearing that and they'll think, how's he gonna do that?
Yep. So I've been, a lot of people say the same thing, like, are you going to still, because, we're involved in so many community volunteer things already in the city. Like we run the farmers market downtown, if you're ever downtown on a Saturday. I currently run a team of military volunteers that have done over 7,000 hours of volunteer service in the community in the past year alone. And a lot of people are like, how are you going to do all this stuff if you're working, 40-hour, 50-hour week as a sheriff? People seem to forget that up until October 1st, I was a full-time active duty Coast Guard officer. So everything that anybody's seen me do here in the city of Portsmouth that led to us being, my wife and I were named first citizens of the city of Portsmouth last year for all that volunteer activity. That was all happening while I was fully employed in a full-time job as the liaison to the White House Office of Management and Budget, as the Coast Guard's chief evaluation officer working on the Commandant's direct report staff. So I've got the bandwidth, I've got the energy, and I'm passionate about this because I know the potential that this city has. I know how much Portsmouth can quickly blossom into if it stops being held back by some of these very, very core issues that we're facing.
Well, Jim, no matter what happens, if you want to help me coordinate my life, I think that would be great. Sarah, I'm sitting here listening to him, and I'm like, that is a lot to carry at one time, and then to still to volunteer in that way as well. So definitely
come on out
to you in that space.
Tomorrow night we're going to be helping with a concert with our volunteers. I got a yellow vest that'll fit you just right. You look like a size medium to large, schmedium. We'll get you in a yellow vest. We'll get you out there volunteering and help you get involved in the community. It's very rewarding.
Showing in the
That's right. You got to show the guns. That's exactly right.
Anything else you want to share to those who will watch this, who may be watching it live, who will see it on our app or on YouTube? Anything you would like to tell them as to why you believe they should vote for you come this election?
We've covered a lot of ground.
We've covered a lot.
But the main thing is, if you're voting for me, you're voting for a truer reimagining of what the sheriff's office, what the role is in the community, and what we can accomplish here in the community. We're going to do some different things, and I say this to any current sheriff's employees: hang on, because we're going to be doing some great stuff, and we're going to play an instrumental role in turning the city around and letting it become what it has the absolute potential and deserves to be.
All right, Jim Cullen running for the Sheriff of Portsmouth. It's been a joy and a pleasure to really get into this conversation with you here this morning. So thank you. I will let you, because I think there's another reporter in the house who wants to talk to you before you head on out. But seriously, thank you very much for coming in, Jim, and sharing your vision for
Eugene,
the department.
I appreciate it.
Okay, for
Sarah,
sure.
Thank you.